and indeed for all wisdom literature in the scriptures, and has written a number of books about preaching and wisdom. You know that she cares deeply about the church and spends most of her Sundays these days in the, I found out, 6,000 member United Methodist Church, Christ United Methodist Church in Plano, Texas, where the pastor of 3 decades invited her to come and be the preaching coach for the preaching team there. You know that she cares deeply about those who are not in church. And a part of what draws her to wanting to make scenes in the pulpit is that she wants to connect with a Twitter and a YouTube generation. And as you have witnessed firsthand this week, Alyce McKenzie is one of the funniest people around. With a wicked sense of humor and the capacity to leave us all laughing as she brings to us her own brand of wisdom. She even writes books for fun, or at least that's what she says was the reason that she and her colleague John Holbert wrote the book, What Not to Say, Avoiding the Common Mistakes That Can Sink Your Sermons. To give you but an example of her humor in that book, let me cite some of the sermon endings Dr. McKenzie encourages us to avoid. The cruel tease sermon ending, in which the preacher prepares everyone to fasten their seat belts and get ready for a landing, and then picks the nose of the plane up and circles the airport about 2 or 3 more times. The nuclear fission ending, in which the preacher doesn't actually end the sermon that has been preached, but introduces a whole new line of provocative thought right at sermon's end. The ice cream sundae ending, in which a sermon concludes with a happy story or a sweet, reassuring statement that doesn't ring true at all to its hearers. Or my personal favorite, the backing over the spikes ending. Isn't that a great title? In which the preacher perhaps has affirmed that we are called to be disciples in the home, in the church, in the community, and has then told us that Jesus Christ is the one who can empower us for discipleship, and then, oops, backs up over those spikes and deflates the sermon by adding on a whole lot of therefore you oughts and you shoulds, rather than saying you can. It has been my personal pleasure to know Alyce McKenzie for over 22 years. We first met when she was finishing up her PhD at Princeton Theological Seminary, and I was joining the faculty there. I have admired her as a scholar and a teacher and a preacher, and flat out enjoyed her as a friend for many years. And so I thought it would be good for this last introduction to tell you a few things you might not know about Alyce McKenzie. Dr. McKenzie secured her PhD and wrote her doctoral dissertation, and indeed accomplished much of what she has accomplished in ministry while raising 3 children with her husband Murray, which, as anyone who's done that knows, is itself a full-time job. Her children are grown now. One of them is in ministry, and her special joy this day is this season in her life is being Gigi, or grandmother, to 2-year-old grandson Graham, whom I can attest from having seen the photos is quite adorable. Alyce has a penchant for novels, and one of my favorite books that she has written is entitled Novel Preaching: Tips from Writers on Crafting Creative Sermons. As the title implies, the book draws on advice from successful fiction writers, including Isabel Allende, Annie Dillard, Toni Morrison, Stephen King, and Frederick Buechner, who but Alyce would have thought to put Buechner and King in the same book, to assist preachers in their writing of creative and evocative sermons. Alyce's secret pleasure is reading mystery novels. And it is my own personal hope that one day she will start writing them. I frankly think that with her wicked sense of humor and her capacity to create scenes, she could be a bestseller. And finally, if you ask Alyce what she would do in life if she did not teach preaching, and serve God in the church, she would tell you she would either be a yoga instructor or a pastry chef. I've got a feeling she could do either with the same flair and finesse, creativity and flexibility she brings to her lectures here in our midst. Alyce, we thank you for all that you are, for all that you do for this beloved field of preaching, for the church, for the world, and especially for the inspiration and insight and sheer wisdom you have brought to us as our 2015 Beecher lecturer. We eagerly look forward to hearing your third and final lecture this morning called The Scenic Sermon. Will you join me in welcoming back Dr. Alyce McKenzie?
Thank you, Nora, for that beautiful introduction. So, which do you think is harder? To begin a sermon well or to end it? How many think begin it? How many think end it? I suppose everyone, how many abstain? The first scene can be tricky, can it? Like the time I told my students that one way to begin a sermon is by saying something dramatic and arresting. And so in a Palm Sunday sermon, after reading the story from Luke of how Jesus rides into Jerusalem on a donkey, a student stood up and began in this way. The ass has been consistently denigrated in Western culture. And so this morning I choose as my theme the ass of peace. Or the time that I instructed my students that personal stories can be a very effective bridge to other people's stories as we point them to God's stories, but that you do need to be careful not to expose too much of yourself. And so Jerry, a man in his 50s from North Carolina, who had had many and varied life experiences before answering a call to ministry, stood up for his first sermon of the semester and began in this way. Friends, there are things that I have done in my life that I hope none of you ever finds out about. So you know the rest of the semester, like, come on, Jerry, just something, just one. I was now going to talk about a variety of ineffective endings, but that, I appreciate that's okay. So there are a lot of ways, aren't there, to end badly. And as the bishop yesterday pointed out, the definition of an optimist is the woman in the choir who puts her shoes on the first time the preacher says, and in conclusion. So several years ago, novelist John Irving came to SMU to deliver the Tate Lectures, and he generously offered to spend an hour with my preaching students the afternoon before his lecture. So we gathered in Kirby Parlor, and through the Palladium windows, the late afternoon sun bathed his ruggedly handsome... Okay, is that too much? Should I dial it back? I'll dial it back. So anyway, he sat there with us, and one of my students asked him, "What advice do you as a novelist have for us preachers?" And his advice was this. He said, "Make sure that the last scene of your sermon grows out of the middle and the beginning." In fact, he said, "I always write the last scene first, and then make sure that every scene that precedes it relentlessly moves the reader toward the last scene." I wonder if that is how John the Evangelist, not John Irving, wrote the scenes in which Nicodemus appears in the Gospel of John. First scene from chapter 19, where Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea take Jesus' body down from the cross, and Nicodemus brings 100 pounds of spices to pack Jesus' body. And the air is filled with the sickly sweet smell of regret. If only I had had more time. And then maybe John wrote the scene from chapter 7 where Nicodemus makes a half-hearted attempt to defend Jesus. And then maybe he wrote the scene from chapter 3 where Nicodemus comes by night and stands on Jesus' front porch, asking, how can I make a coherent narrative from my life events in light of who I think you are? And Jesus' answer, the Holy Spirit blows where it wills, seems to have scared the hell out of him, almost. Now in acting, the actor needs to know the bigger story, including the ending, and play her part one scene at a time as she moves forward to the finale. But Nicodemus moves from episode to episode, distracted from potential faith by fear, distracted from reliance on Jesus by reverence for his position, lacking the will and maybe the skill to risk placing his scenes into a larger saving story. And so the winged word that outlives his present moment is not to decide, is to decide. Remember the article I mentioned on Wednesday? Whenever I do that, just nod. I know you remember. But it was by Tom Long, and it posed the notion that people are losing their narrative competence due to our high-tech digital culture. He actually doesn't think that episodic is a title for a type of person. He thinks we're all diachronic. We all still want to make that story, but we are rusty. We've lost our skills. But suppose that Nicodemus, who actually, as a first-century episodic, was a man before his time, is sitting in your congregation. How will you communicate the saving story to him as he sits before you holding his smartphone, checking his public opinion polls and the 7-day weather forecast, manifesting a phenomenon that social media analysts call CPA, continuous partial attention? I was having lunch with my colleague Elaine Heath some months ago, who teaches evangelism at Perkins. And we were sitting in a red leather booth of a restaurant near SMU, and I was sitting on this side, and Elaine and a student named Holly were sitting on the other side. Holly wanted to meet with us to brainstorm how we could set up a peer group in Houston. And so, my mind drifted from the conversation, and I saw a text come in on my Samsung Note 3, which I, surreptitiously slid under the table, and it was actually a very appealing invitation, and I was drawn into it to see just how appealing. And then I heard Elaine say, "Alice, are you on your phone?" I must have looked guilty. So she said, tapping the table, she's my friend, she can do this. She said, "Alice, please be here." I didn't blame her. I mean, I was caught in the flagrant public act of CPA. Educator Linda Stone coined the term continuous partial attention to distinguish it from multitasking. She says multitasking is about efficiency and productivity, but CPA is the increasing inability and undesire to pay full attention to just one task, just one item, just one person, instead of continually scanning for other opportunities while waiting for the next interruption. So CPA. Another factor in our social context is what I would say is the fact that our mind has become our medium. Adam Thomas, in his book Digital Disciple, suggests that constant online activity isolates us from ourselves. He suggests that the classification Homo sapiens is becoming less and less accurate. As I store more of my memory and capacity to solve problems outside of my own mind, the wisdom, sapiens, which marks me as a member of the human race, is withering and dying, leaving me with no practice for searching my interior self. In 1964, just as the Beatles were launching their invasion of America's airwaves, Marshall McLuhan published his book, Understanding Media, The Extensions of Man. in which he coined the phrase, "The medium is the message." A popular medium, he said, molds what we see and how we see it, until eventually, if we use it enough, it changes who we are as individuals and as a society. He says this: "The effects of technology do not occur at the level of opinions or concepts. Rather, they alter patterns of perception steadily and without any resistance." Nicholas Carr's work, The Shallows, How the Internet is Affecting Our Brains, says this: "Consider yourself. As you enter keywords into your Google search box and begin to follow a trail of links, what you see is a mind consumed by a medium. Due to our online rapid hunting of information," he says, "many of us are developing neural circuitry customized for rapid and incisive spurts of directed attention. We are losing the neurons for concentration and meditation, those that support calm, linear thought, the ones that we use in traversing a lengthy narrative or an involved argument, the ones that we draw on when we reflect on our own experiences or contemplate some outward or inward phenomenon. According to Carr, intensive multitaskers are suckers for irrelevancy. As Thomas Merton put it, our minds are like crows. They pick up everything that glitters, no matter how uncomfortable our nest gets with all that metal in it." Says Carr, borrowing a phrase from T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets, "The net encourages a state in which we are distracted from distraction by distraction." We think that we are multitaskers, but actually we are not. We are serial taskers, task shifters. Rather than engaging in simultaneous tasks, we in fact shift from one task to another in rapid succession. For example, you switch from your phone conversation to a document on your computer screen to an email and back again in the belief that you were doing them all simultaneously, but you're not. And this is why, although this is not the message I came here to deliver primarily, but this is why we should not text while driving. Now, when my children were younger, I tried to show a lively interest in their educations. And at that time, I was working alone at home on my Proverbs dissertation. So when they came home from school, I was hungry for conversation. So every afternoon, I would greet them with the same kind of questions. "How was school today? What did you do today? What are you learning about now?" So one afternoon, when our son Matt, now in his mid-20s, who was in Mrs. Hauser's second grade class, came home, he came home prepared. "What are you learning in school now?" I asked brightly. With a serious expression on his cherubic young face, he replied, "We're doing a unit called Sex is Interesting." Oh. I was trying to wrap my mind around this theme and my mental picture of Mrs. Hauser, whom I just met at a parent-school conference. And I thought to myself, "Oh, okay, well, yeah, it seems a little early, but yeah." He wasn't done with me yet. He continued, "Our homework for tonight is to make a collage of pictures of naked people from magazines." His deadpan was that good that I actually began mentally going through our magazine subscriptions. Okay, Woman's Day, Time, Business Week, well, maybe Christian Century. And then I spied his little grin and he said, "Gotcha." So now you know that people are going to barrage you with questions after these 3 sessions. They're going to say, "What were the Beecher lectures about? What'd you learn about? What'd you learn?" So just tell them, "We learned that scenes are interesting." And we gathered a collage of options for using scenes in sermons to reach people suffering from continuous partial attention and serial tasking in our homiletical mission field. And that'll shut them up. What I want to suggest are a couple of sermon shapes that use scenes. One, the multi-scene sermon, and one, the single-scene sermon. There are a lot of other options, so my purpose is not to offer blueprints for sermons specifically, but to offer some evocative approaches in those two ways. So let's talk then about the multi-scene sermon, which I think is a good thing for serial taskers, task shifters. I talked, as you remember, on Thursday about the fact that in the new homiletic, or maybe it was Wednesday, anyway, the new homiletic, they had the notion that people had this narrative competence, and many of the plots of their sermons moved from complication to resolution through a series of moves. So there's still some value in that, I believe, with some tweaks that I'll talk about right now. The multi-scene sermon moves across our vision like pictures on a smartphone. The new homiletic sermon could be somewhat meandering and inductive until the big reveal at the end. But today's multi-scene sermon, I believe, needs to be more clear. In 2015, the multi-scene sermon can move inductively, but it needs crystal clear transition statements to summarize what's gone before and to propel towards what's coming next. People need, this makes sense, doesn't it, that people need even more clarity in how these scenes are connected, just as we do in everyday life. And I think they need the preacher to spell out more directly how they can apply the message at the end of their sermon than perhaps they did in the 70s. So the first tweak, I would say, is be clear. Be clear. And then the next one is be compelling. Be compelling. The multi-scene sermon progresses as a sequence of scenes, each with a specific purpose and sequence. Each scene needs sensory cues to invite you in. Remember the concrete, significant detail. The sequence of scenes has got to have this forward-moving motion with each scene propelling you to the next scene as a listener. And there cannot be any extraneous scenes. Carl Iglesias, who's a novelist and screenwriter, challenges screenwriters to this: to imagine your script, substitute sermon, as a house of cards, and each scene is a card. If you can remove a scene from your sermon and the house still stands, leave it out. I have come to believe through painful autobiographical experience that a sermon, the effectiveness of a sermon, is related as much to what I leave out as to what I include. So once you've written a scene, then reread it and ask yourself, what is the purpose of this scene? And by the end of it, what do I want listeners to feel, to think, and then to wonder as we propel them to the next scene? Novelist and screenwriter Raymond Obstfeld advises his students to think of each scene in their work as an inner tube designed to keep the larger work afloat. So you know what a nice, fully inflated inner tube looks like compared to one that is losing air fast. So the more memorable scenes there are, he says, the more that we see this entire structure floating in front of us, and therefore the more we appreciate the whole work. The fewer memorable scenes there are, the quicker that your screenplay, novel, movie sermon will sink into mediocrity. So a couple examples then maybe of clear and compelling sermons. I heard a sermon one time in which, so basically a 3 kind of scene shift. In the first scene, this is a very simple sermon, which I still remember years later. In the first scene, he described a young couple in their kitchen having a blowout marital quarrel because I think he forgot to pick up the dry cleaning. And there were expletives involved, and there were things that were said that should never have been said, that can never be forgotten. And then he moved to his text. And you have a lot of different choices for what kind of scene from Scripture you might want to pair with that. So he moved to his text, which was, I believe it was Beloved, Let Us Love One Another. So he fleshed that out as a scene. And then he simply went back to the same scene and said, how would it replay if we applied the theme of the text? And you might say, well, that's just too specific. Well, there are things that you can do, of course, to sort of say, invite others in, even if they didn't just have a blowout marital quarrel. So I thought the fact that I remembered that all those years later was telling, as a very simple scene-shifting sermon. So then, several weeks ago, I preached a sermon on the parable of the unforgiving servant from Matthew 18. And you might say, wow, you did a 3-point sermon on a parable. What are you doing? But it was more like a scene-shifting kind of sermon in which I made really clear at the end of each of the moves where we were going next. You don't have to tell everybody right at the beginning. You can kind of reveal it very clearly as you move through. So it was called Forgiveness Impossible, based on the Food Network show. I had seen a scene from that in which a woman was confronted and refused to I won't go into all that. We have limited time. I would love to. Self-discipline, right? So anyway, Forgiveness Impossible. The first scene was that Food Network story, and the message in that was that some people have trouble asking for forgiveness. Then I moved into another scene, the theme of which was revealed at the end. Some people have trouble giving forgiveness. And then the third scene, based on a student who'd given me permission to tell a story about his guilt at being imprisoned and a vision of Jesus in prison. The third scene was, some people have trouble accepting divine forgiveness. So you just move it through. People don't exactly know the whole picture, but you gradually and very clearly let them know where you're going. So, and the title was Forgiveness Impossible ? So be clear, be compelling, by basically what I've just talked about were screenwriting principles, which probably didn't bowl you over because it's kind of common sense, right? But so be clear, be compelling, and be chaotic. How about that? I'll explain. Respect the congregation's experience of the complexity and ambiguity of life by not presenting false hope and easy answers. One of my favorite pieces of advice, probably my favorite piece of advice from the whole book, Novel Preaching, comes from novelist Edith Wharton. She says, choose a subject worthy of your audience. That would exclude prosperity preaching. Choose a subject worthy of your audience. So let's apply that to our scene sequences. Choose scene sequences for your sermons across the weeks and years that are worthy of your congregation, that are worthy of their experience of the ambiguities of life and the complexities of Scripture. Our congregation knows that complication doesn't always lead to resolution. Itch does not always lead to scratch. If we are faithful to the gospel in our preaching, we will know that the good news doesn't always simplify our lives and make us more functional. Sometimes it pours itching powder all over us. And often it says to us, like John Dominic Crossan says, the parables say to us, oh, you have built a fine home, but I'm here to tell you that you've built it on a fault line. So what about sprinkled here and there throughout the year? A multi-scene sermon that begins with resolution and then complicates it. Now, it's great to be a professor of preaching. You can say, go and try this and let me know how it goes. So here is our neat and tidy life, and here's the gospel, and here is our messy, overturned life by the gospel, and finally, in what way could this possibly be a good thing for us in the world? You got a 4-part sequence there. Try it. Let me know. My email is easily accessible. Or how about a sermon like the one preached 2 weeks after Katrina in this very chapel by Professor Carolyn Sharp that Dr. Tidsale included in her book, Prophetic Preaching, A Pastoral Response. I think it's a great example of a sermon that acknowledges the complexity of life without feeling compelled to offer easy answers. Professor Sharp's sermon invited worshipers to lament and to call for justice refusing to offer easy hope. She ended her sermon by quoting Matthew 2:18, Rachel weeping for her children, refusing to be consoled because they are no more. She charged listeners to refuse to be consoled, but rather to offer to God the sacrifice of our passion for justice and compassion for those who suffer. Or how about a series of sermons that goes like this, a series of scenes that goes like this. Here's the good news. Here is how we live. What is it about the good news that you don't understand? Here's the good news again. Try it. So those are some ideas about the multi-scene sermon for task shifters. The second type of sermon is the single scene sermon, which I think is maybe very tailor-made for people with continuous partial attention. You could also call it maybe the home screen sermon. A home screen or start screen is the main screen on a mobile operating system or computer program. Home screens are not identical because users rearrange icons as they please, and home screens often differ across mobile operating systems. Almost every smartphone has some form of home screen, which typically displays links to applications, settings, and notifications. Thank you, Wikipedia. So a single scene sermon is like my friend Elaine tapping, saying, Alice, be here. You invite people into one scene, and you keep coming back to it as the home screen. It's aphoristic thinking. In aphoristic proverbial thinking, the wisdom teacher invites listeners into the scene, which sends them back into their long experience to discern scenes that fit it, and then forward as they project how it might apply to scenes that lie in their future. Holding on to it as a sort of ethical flashlight for whatever dark paths may lie ahead. Now, you know that every scene is preceded by a scene. That is true of the Bible, and that is true of your listeners as they come to worship, which is itself a scene. They come from scenes in their own life into the worship scene. Maybe that young couple on the front row did just come from a blowout kind of fight. Maybe she's sitting there, he's sitting there, both thinking the same thing. I hate him. I hate her. There is no way I'm spending the rest of my life with that. Maybe the college student on the back row is flushed with shame over the scenes from last night that flashed through his or her mind. I can't believe that I acted like that. That is not me. Maybe somebody's sitting there whose listening heart has been rubbed raw by scenes of refugees and their children crammed into boats with inadequate life preservers. And they're sitting there in that scene thinking we have to do something about this as a community. In a single scene sermon, we distract them from their distractions by inviting them into a palm-sized scene. It can be from your experience. It can be from something that you read. It can be from Scripture. It can be a scene from a current event. But whatever it is that you're going to invite people into, you pull them in, you help them explore the setting, the characters with conflict, the imagery, the plot, shaped by the theme, because, right, a scene can have one theme. Pull them in. And then you go out and get some other things and pull them in. Make connections between the scene and if it's a personal scene from Scripture, if it's a scriptural scene from human experience. So let's look at a couple examples of the home screen or single scene sermon. So what about a historical scene that you paint for people? The example I think of here is, this wasn't actually a sermon, it was a whole course that a graduate student from SMU, Ken Lawyer, now serving a church in Pennsylvania, he went to Moscow with a translator to teach a course on the theology and history of Methodism. And he took a picture, he took the George Washington Brownlow's painting entitled John Wesley Preaching on His Father's Grave. And St. Andrew's is in the back at Epworth, England. Every morning he put the picture up in front of the students, and he proceeded just along narrative lines. Who is that, first of all? And what scene came before this one? Who is that? Where? Why is he standing there? Who are they? Why are they here? What are they getting from him? And then what's the scene that comes after this one? It is actually, when you think about scenes, they're a very beautiful way of thinking about the purpose of preaching. You invite people into scenes, and your purpose then is to send them into whatever scene is next, empowered to play their role with more compassion and more justice. So that was Ken Lawyer's use of scene historically. So I might use the story I told about Leontine Kelly and Mary McLeod Bethune as the main screen, the home screen of a sermon. And maybe I would connect it with 2 Corinthians 3:18. We all with unveiled faces, beholding the glory of God as though reflected in a mirror, are being transformed into the same image from one degree of another. Or I might pair it with Proverbs 1, wisdom stands at the crossroads and invites people onto the path. Or, I might preach a sermon in which the home screen is a lifeboat filled with refugees, right? And connect that to Matthew 25. When did we see you? So the dynamic, though, is here's the home screen, you pull people in. Dr. Tidsale mentioned that I have a 2-year-old grandson. And I think that we can learn a lot about narrative from children. So his father is here, and I'll just have to say that his parents are raising him to be a good Episcopalian boy. So they pray with him. There we go. They pray with him in the morning. They pray with him at night, and he has his own Bible. And so who is going to teach him the sacred stories of the Grimm's brothers, if not for Grandma, right? So I was putting him to bed and telling him the story of the Little Red Riding Hood. Lovely story for children, isn't it? and so started out. I like the final scene is kind of my favorite, where it's like, Grandma, what big teeth you have! The better to eat you with, my dear. But then there were a couple biting incidents at school, and I thought maybe I better lay off of that one. So anyway, we started into this scene, and I said, okay, so what happens, Graham, is that Grandma is not feeling very well, so she puts on her nightgown and her hat, and then this wolf comes in and eats her, and puts on her nightgown and hat, and gets into her bed. And Little Red Riding Hood's mother, unbeknownst, doesn't know anything about all of this. And let me say before this that Graham's pastor is Pastor Paul. Graham loves Curious George, and his best friend's name is Char, for Charlie. So Little Red Riding Hood's mother gives her a basket, and she fills it with muffins, maybe some Jack Daniels, whatever you want to put in there as the creative storyteller. There's the thing. And Little Red Riding Hood set off across the forest to visit her grandmother. He says, and Char. I said, okay, so Little Red Riding Hood and Char set off across the forest to grandmother. He says, and Pastor Paul. I said, okay, so Little Red Riding Hood and Char and Pastor Paul. And then he says, and Curious George. I mean, he can have anybody in his story that he wants. So apparently at that point, the full component of characters satisfied him. So Little Red Riding Hood, Curious George, Pastor Paul, and Char set off across the forest. So he's got a home screen. He's pulling in things from his imagination. So if you have a biblical scene and you invite them to come into the scene, you have a kind of interesting sermon that has all kinds of possibilities. And I'll give you an example of one I preached on April 19th, entitled Locked in a Room with Open Doors. Not the whole thing, just a couple snippets of it. So in 1962, preacher, author, and preaching professor Ernest Campbell preached a sermon called Locked in a Room with Open Doors. He applied it to a different time, and he applied it to a different text, one from Deuteronomy. So I thank you, Dr. Campbell, for the sermon spark of your title, which I now make my own for this time and this text from the 20th chapter of John, the events that occurred on the evening of Easter morning. When it was evening on that day, the first day of the week, and the doors of the house where the disciples had met were locked for fear of the Jews, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." After he said this, he showed them his hands and his side, and then the disciples rejoiced when they saw the Lord. And Jesus said to them again, "Peace be with you." As the Father has sent me, so I send you." And when he had said this, he breathed on them, and he said to them, "Receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive the sins of any, they are forgiven. If you retain the sins of any, they are retained." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So I'm starting to feel somewhat claustrophobic. Why are we still in here? I understand there's risk and danger out there, but is huddling together in a panic room really the most productive response to the news that one we thought was dead is alive? We're the ones who locked ourselves in. There's nothing to stop us from busting out, is there? These disciples remind me of something I saw years ago when my children were little and our family went with my older brother Wade and his family to the Philadelphia Zoo. Wade is 6'5" with a shock of copper color hair, blue eyes, and the family nose. He and Sharon brought their two children. Marie and I brought ours. I opted out of the visit to the reptile house and wandered off on my own in a rather reflective mood toward the bear exhibit. And there I saw a tall red-haired man standing at the rail and went over and stood next to him, leaning against him companionably. I didn't bother to look over at him. My attention was focused on the bears. You know that many zoos have moved away from the tight confinement of cages to more open habitats. And so as I looked across the exhibit, there were the younger bears just kind of strutting around, being bears. But there in the back, way at the back, in the left side, there was an older bear. He was a mangy bear, and he looked kind of funny out of his eyes. And I have to demonstrate what he was doing. I won't get down on all fours. I'm not going that far, but here's what he was doing. As I sit here looking at the disciples, I think the bear would be quite happy in here with all of us. He would be so preoccupied with his pacing that he wouldn't be a threat to us at all. My 21-year-old self would be quite content to be in here with us. Then I talk about a time when I was just starting in ministry where I was pacing a cage of insecurity and doubt. And then some other examples that would include their lives and invite them in. And then this. I see a shadow outside by the window. I wonder if that's Jesus, reenacting that lovely painting by Warner Salmon called Christ at Heart's Door, based on Revelation 3:20. "Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come into you and eat with you, and you with me." You know, maybe that's not Jesus. He doesn't resemble the Jesus of artist Warner Salmon's painting much. He doesn't have alabaster skin and shoulder-length auburn hair. He also doesn't look very patient. I wonder what he's thinking to himself as he stands there. Maybe I do not have time to stand out here and watch you pace your cages anymore. I'm coming in. And then it goes on to what an entrance, what a greeting, what an exit. And I do some teaching. I wanted to make this point that it's a time now when teaching is more important than ever, and the home screen sermon is a way you can do some teaching within the confines of a scene. So I do some of that, and then the ending. And part of the teaching I talk about how Jesus in John can both eat fish and pass through walls, some of that theological background. All right, so the ending is this. I don't know how long I stood there watching his endless pacing of his cage with no bars, mesmerized, until finally I elbowed the tall red-haired man I'd been leaning against and pointed to the bear. And I said, "You know, he kind of reminds me of me." And then I looked up at him. Right color hair, right height, wrong nose, green eyes. Still he grinned and he laughed. And he said, Yeah, I know what you mean. Don't you kind of wonder when he is ever going to stop? Here's an example from literature, which is a wonderful source of scenes. This is from Geraldine Brooks' novel, March. And I'd invite you to observe what the main character is doing while he's in church. As the North reels under a series of unexpected defeats during the first year of the Civil War, one man leaves his family and he aids the Union cause. Geraldine Brooks takes the character of the absent father, Mr. March, who has gone off to war, from Louisa May Alcott's classic Little Women. Mr. March sits in church, itself a scene, itself a home screen, and see what insights he pulls in. So he says this: "From my youth I have been unorthodox in my faith. I could never reconcile the Calvinist stern preachments that we are all of us, even radiant babes, sin-saturated. Nor could I bring myself to believe in a deity whose finger touched every man's slightest doing. To me, the divine is that immanence which is apparent in the great glories of nature and in the small kindnesses of the human heart. And yet, for a few moments, in a little church on the outskirts of Petersburg, I did feel as if a power revealed itself to me and made known to me what I was to do next. I had noted a Bible study underway, and with no more pressing business, on a whim I decided to join it. Why I did so I will never rightly know, as I have long since given up any expectation of gaining spiritual sustenance in churches, finding only stale and pompous ritual in the North and primitive superstition in the South. Nevertheless, I entered the small clapboard building, unremarkable, except that it happened to be set down in that part of the square adjacent to a courtyard where slaves from time to time were put up for auction. It happened that just such a sale commenced in the course of the Bible study hour. So as with one ear we heard the good news of great joy that shall be to all people, with the other we heard the resonant voice of the auctioneer cry out. I'm not going to cry out what the auctioneer cried out. As we contemplated the teachings to be drawn from the greatest life that ever lived, the voice without was crying up the lot in hand. 2 children without a mother, kidnapped from here. My thoughts flew to the verse, "Suffer the little children to come to me." And had I then the means, I would have marched out and bought those children their freedom. What was most striking to me was that no one in the church seemed to mark what was going on without. And when the pastor asked for subscriptions to aid in sending the scriptures into Africa, I could bear this no longer, but I stood in my place and I said, how was it that the good news could not be sent more cheaply to the beings on the auction block next door? This was greeted with hisses and tuttings and a cold request that I leave, which I did, speedily and without regret. And one more single-scene sermon based on a personal story. Some years ago, 12 to be precise, my father, who had been kind of larger than life, a novelist, a magazine publisher, author of several historical novels, Robert Fowler, Jr., he lay dying of liver cancer in their home in Camp Hill, Pennsylvania. So I was there to keep my mother company and comfort her. And my younger brother, Robert, his wife, Sally, and their little girl, Ava, were also there. So my mother, who had always been the quintessential Southern hostess, was sitting in the living room. People were wanting to come by. There were people coming by from time to time to pay their respects because hospice had come in and there was the morphine drip. So she was sitting in the living room with her hands in her lap, just staring at her hands. I was in the kitchen wearing a pair of elbow-high rubber gloves, yellow, and I had the Comet and I had a sponge, and I was scrubbing out the kitchen sink. Because you know that it is very important to have your sink spotless while your father is dying down the hall of liver cancer. And so at that point, the doorbell rang, and I sighed and began to take off the rubber gloves because being met at anyone's door when they're wearing rubber gloves is kind of creepy. So I started to take them off, and as I looked around the corner into the hall, I heard a little voice. I saw that 5-year-old Ava had made it to the door ahead of me. And she was opening the door, and she was saying, "Hello, have you come to see my grandpa?" And as this couple that had known my parents for years came in, she got between them and took them each by the hand and led them back the hall to see her grandfather. Now, I don't know exactly what I would do with that, but that seems to be a personal scene that certainly has scriptural connections, certainly has connections with other people's experience, I would think. And so it would be up to me then to remember that story, to save it away, and to brainstorm, pray about how it might become someday a single scene sermon. There's always somebody at the door, isn't there? Asking the preacher, "Who do you plan to be?" You must be somebody. Maybe I plan to be a sage, a preacher who preaches with a listening heart, a scene maker for postmoderns who don't think we can say anything about God because the wisdom literature acknowledges the limitations of human wisdom and the transcendence of God, and the fact that wisdom by definition is a group process. Maybe I plan to be a sage who preaches scenic sermons for secularists who do not believe that God is active in the everyday realm, because I specialize, as sagely preachers do, in knack for noticing the inscape, the landscape, and the textscape. Maybe I plan to be a sage, a scene maker, who preaches scenic sermons for pluralists, who don't believe there's a distinctive Christian way of life and portrayal of God, because as a sagely preacher, I practice what I preach, but more I preach what I practice, and model a distinctive way of life composed of the fear of the Lord that issues forth in the listening heart. Maybe I plan to be somebody who lives out my life scene by scene with a listening heart, with the result that my life becomes the most persuasive multi-scene sermon that the congregation will ever experience. Preaching to people who right now are sitting there with their faith not fully formed and their attention flitting. Maybe by being fully attentive to within, without, and the text, we become people who are right now preparing the poignant, powerful, single-scene sermon that they will preach to others. I once heard an old preacher preaching on death, and he said this. He said, "Everybody's death has a vehicle. For some it's cancer, for some it's violence, for some it's a heart attack, and for some it's old age." Now at that point, I left his home screen. And you know people do, right? We can't control where they wander while we preach. I left his home screen, and I went into an inner scenic world that I created of my own. And in my imagination, I was in my home in Allen, Texas, and the house was full of relatives, and we had been having a festive family dinner. Somebody, I think it was cousin Martin, said, hey, there's a limo pulling up at the curb. A long limo. Who called the limo? I looked around. I said, Bill, Catherine, I thought you were staying till tomorrow. Jim, Margaret, I told you I'd drive you to the airport. Who ordered the limo? Zach, Laura, Dallas, Rebecca, Murray? I went to the door and I cracked it and I looked out, and there was a man standing by the limo holding a sign. And as I looked closer, I thought, oh my God, my name is on the sign, and it's even spelled correctly. But I didn't order a limo. I'm not scheduled to take a trip. And where am I going? How long am I going to be gone for? 3 days? A week? That has serious implications for how many pairs of shoes I will need to pack. And then I came back to the preacher's sermon. He was just wrapping up. Everybody's death, he said, has its vehicle. And he ended his sermon with these words of wisdom. The trick is, my friends, to have your faith tank all filled up when your vehicle arrives. A friend of mine was recently convinced to go skydiving with his son, who is in special ops. On the way to the field, he had a moment of anxiety, picturing the scene in which he jumped from the plane. Son, what do I do if my ripcord doesn't work? He asked. Don't worry, Dad, said his son. You will have the rest of your life to figure it out. I feel a sense of urgency about our task, do you? So don't make a scene. This command is usually hissed through clenched teeth, maybe spoken by a mom to a toddler at Target, perhaps said by a lawyer to her client on the way into the courtroom. Let me do the talking. Don't make a scene. Perhaps overheard at what began as a romantic dinner at the table next to you in a restaurant. Not here. Don't make a scene. But friends, at this point in my teaching, my preaching, and my writing, my advice to all of us is exactly the opposite. Make a scene. For God's sake, make a scene in the pulpit.